Well, we're here trying to do this thing online today, do your virtual classes to continue those of you in the RCIA program to continue doing your studies. And for all of those in the parish, we're happy to invite you to participate and watch these videos as we finish out the year of the RCIA and Adult Faith Formation classes. So this is one of our mini lessons that we're doing for the RCIA, and this one deals with the religious orders in the Catholic Church. For someone coming into the church, this might be something new or something they don't really understand. They see monks and nuns and friars. They don't know what that means. Well, we're going to answer all those questions today. So let's jump right in as we turn and figure out what all these things are. So what is a religious order when we talk about a religious order? Well, it is a community of Catholic faithful who live the gospel in accordance with a specific rule or particular charism. And I'll describe what that means in a moment. It's typically characterized by the principles of its founder. So then we'll talk about a few of those as well. Members of an order are consecrated to Christ, and they all make perpetual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. We'll talk about why that is. Now, some orders make other particular vows, but they all have those three at least. So, for example, one of the Benedictine orders, they make a vow of stability, meaning that they will stay in their particular house there forever or for the rest of their lives. Others make particular vows in addition to those three, but those three are common to them all. Now, such communities have their origins in the earliest years of the Christian faith. You'll start seeing them very early on, beginning when some of the early fathers went out and kind of separated themselves from the rest of society in a way to kind of radically embrace the gospel values and dedicate their lives to prayer and other good works. And so it kind of caught on from there. A religious order might consist of consecrated laity, what we would call brothers and sisters, or clergy, or both. So all the members might simply be called religious. So when we say that this and they're a religious, that doesn't mean that they practice their faith religiously. Hopefully we all do. It just means that kind of determines that they belong to a religious order. We might simply call them religious. So notice that a religious order might have brothers and clergy or both. So for example, in perhaps the Franciscan order, for example, there might be some that are priests and some that are brothers. That they remain non-ordained for the rest of their lives, and there may be any number of reasons for that. And that we refer to the consecrated, to the brothers and sisters, since they're not priests, they are laity still, but they are consecrated laity. But we call them all religious, right? Now, some religious orders are more properly classified as congregations or societies or institutes of religious life. That's the more formal name of them. But for simplicity, we're just going to call them all religious orders. So, you've heard of many of the common religious orders, but how many are there in the church? And the answer is there's hundreds of them. It's one of the enduring mysteries of the church. How many religious orders are there in the world? God knows himself. Although I'm sure there's somebody in some office in the Vatican knows how many there are. There are lots of them. Many of them are quite small. Many of them are limited in geographically to a particular country, a particular province, even one particular house. But there are many hundreds of them. And sadly, many of them are kind of dying out now. The last 50 or 60 years or so have seen a great number of these houses dying out for lack of vocations, and there's any number of reasons for that. And you'll find lots of opinions about why that is out there. But that's the sad truth. But there are still many who are doing quite well. Now, among the larger ones and the better known ones, These are some that many of you may have heard about. First, the Order of Preachers. I'm giving you their formal name, but sometimes you'll hear them called the Dominicans, right? They were founded in 1216 AD by Saint Dominic. They just had their 800th anniversary just a few years ago. So the order, but their formal name is the Order of Preachers, and you'll often see a little OP after their names. That tells you they're Dominicans, the Order of Preachers. There's also the Order of Friars Minor, also commonly called the Franciscans. They were founded, of course, by St. Francis of Assisi in the year 1209. They also just had their 800th anniversary not too long ago. You'll see a few branches of the Franciscans, whether it's the OFMs, the Order of Friars Minor. There's the OFM Capuchins. There's the Third Order Regulars. There's the conventual friars. There's a whole bunch, but there's several of branches of Franciscans. But this is the original one, the Order of Friars Minor. There's the Order of Saint Benedict, also known commonly as the Benedictines, founded way back in 529 by Saint Benedict. They're coming up on their 1500th anniversary pretty soon. There's the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits, founded in 1540 by Saint Ignatius of Loyola. And so, yeah, when someone says, "Oh, yeah, he's a Jesuit priest," what does that mean? I mean, no, they're Catholic, right? Probably. But it means that they belong to the Society of Jesus. They're one of the Jesuits. So that means he's still a priest, just like I'm a priest or anyone else. A Benedictine priest, a Franciscan priest, a Dominican priest. They're all priests, just like I am. They receive the same order or say the sacrament of holy orders that I receive. But they belong to a religious order in this case. So, everyone's heard of the Missionaries of Charity. That's the formal name of the congregation founded by Saint Teresa, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, just back in 1950, so 70 years ago. Isn't that something? What a tremendous amount of good that they do around the world. And some of you may have heard of the Order of the Brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mount Carmel, or more commonly known as the Carmelites, founded in the 12th century AD. Those are some of the more larger and better known religious orders out there. There are several others that you might have heard of, but those are some of the more common ones. Then we talked about charisms. And so we say, what is a charism? So a charism of a religious order refers to the distinct spirit that animates the community and gives it its particular character. It can refer to the permanent heritage of the order, including its rule. In other words, the rule is how is it that they live? How is it that what is their common day-to-day work? What is all the things that they do? Their rule, their mission, their history, their traditions, that's kind of their charism. The charism is what they do and how they do it, in other words. Let me give you some examples. So I want to make a distinction in these charisms and talking about a bit of a broad spectrum here. I don't want to oversimplify it, but just to give you a rough idea, we might say that some orders have a more contemplative charism and some have a more active charism. And I don't mean to say that it's either one or the other. They're not mutually exclusive categories, but let me try to give you an idea what I mean. The quote-unquote active orders, right, might be engaged in, let's see if I can fix this. A little better, not really. The active orders might be engaged. We're trying to deal with this new technology here. Let's see if we can. I made it worse. Well, either way, active orders might be engaged in education, healthcare, parish work, missionary work, serving the poor, spiritual direction, etc. We call active, right? I hate to say it in this way. They're doing something, right? You'll see teaching orders whose charism is to teach in elementary schools in poor areas, for example, or those who work in hospitals. Lots of religious orders, female religious orders, worked in hospitals traditionally. Many out there doing missionary work in the mission territories of the world. Many, such as Mother Teresa's group, does the service of the poor. So like I said, the missionaries at Charity are a good example. They're active. Their charism is rooted in communal life and prayer on the one hand, but it's really in service to the poorest of the poor. So as you can see, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive here, but they do have an active charism. Now, on the other hand, a contemplative order is more engaged, more dedicated to prayer, work, and study. The Benedictines are a good example of that, and other ones are a branch of them called the Cistercians of the strict observance, also known as the Trappists, are an example of a contemplative order. So their charism is rooted in personal and communal prayer, silence, study and contemplation, and manual labor. And that's kind of, if you visit a Trappist monastery, that's what you'll see the brothers there doing. There's a lot of time dedicated to personal and communal prayer, most of the day and basically in silence. They don't do a lot of unnecessary, flapping their gums all day. A lot of study, a lot of contemplation, and they're dedicated in some way to support themselves into manual labor. And you say, well, are they working? And the answer is yes. That's their work. That's their call. And in fact, that's considered the highest calling of those contemplative orders that dedicate themselves more completely to prayer and study and work. And indeed, those are some of the most beautiful and prayerful places you can visit. And their work for the church, while perhaps not seen in the way that Mother Teresa's nuns are seen, is still a vital part of the work. They really are the unseen lungs of the church, dedicated to prayer and worship of God for the good of the church and the glory of God. So moving on. All of these charisms are approved by the church. Yeah, you can't just start a religious order and say, yeah, we're going to pray the rosary 10 times a day, kneeling on broken glass. Well, that's wonderful, maybe, if you want to do that, but that would never get approved by the church. Right, so all these charisms are approved by the church. Their rule, their way of life is approved by the church. All of them include elements of the active and the contemplative. So you'll see that. It's very much, many of them involve both of them. They have communal life and communal prayer and things, but yet they're engaged in some way in the world, doing something out in the world for the good of others. All are dedicated to serving and imitating Christ in a particular way, according to their calling, to their charism, right? And of course, that's the whole point of religious life. I want to serve and imitate Christ. So in a particularly radical way. And so those involved in religious orders feel that particular call to live the gospel in a certain way. And so they go and join others who share that same calling. And I know what you might be thinking. This sounds like a dreary way of life, and maybe it would be for you. But for those who are there, they're the most joyful and happy people you can imagine, right? Because they've answered the call, their specific call to Christ, to live in a specific way according to that charism. And indeed, they're some of the most wonderful people you'll meet. So all of the various religious orders enrich the church, not only by their radical embrace of the gospel, but also by the many works that they perform for the good of the people everywhere. And again, just because an order is more contemplative doesn't mean they're not working. That prayer, that contemplation, the prayer, the praise of God, that's the great work of the church. And indeed, that benefits all of us. So, keep in mind that right now there are monks and nuns in contemplative silent orders all around the world, praying for us, praying for the good of the church, praying God's graces upon us all. And it's an answer to their prayers that God and gives us countless blessings that we'll only know of in the life to come. But indeed, that is seen as the greatest work of the church, what they do. So there's something called evangelical councils there. And what does we mean by that? Uh, the perpetual vows that religious take, perpetual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which are common to all the religious orders, are known as the evangelical councils. That's the fancy way of saying those. When we talk about the evangelical councils, that means those three vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now, those three things are not necessary for eternal salvation. In other words, you don't have to make those vows in order to go to heaven, but rather, they are pursued by those who wish and are called to go further toward receiving Christian perfection, right? We're not all called to those things, to make those vows, but in a sense, we all are called to them. We are called to a certain poverty of spirit, not being attached to the things of the world, right? But being detached from them, as good as they are. We're all called to be chaste, no matter our relationship. Even in marriage, you're called to a certain level of chastity, right? And we're all called to obedience to the good will of God, right? And in a larger sense, or I should say in a smaller sense, to the obedience to our lawful authorities. So all of us have those calls and live them to an extent. But in the case of the religious, they live them more radically and fully, right? And that's a good thing. So again, we can think of them as a radical rejection of the great temptations of the world, the flesh, and the devil. I've talked about these before, how those are the three great enemies of our soul. The world, which seeks to suck us into worldly things, right? The flesh, with its focus on the pleasure and the things of the body, the things of the world, and the devil, who's always after our souls, right? But you can think of it this way, too, that the religious, in making those vows, those evangelical councils, are in a radical sense rejecting those things. Think of it this way. They reject the world in the sense that they are trying to detach themselves from the world by making a vow of poverty. They're separating themselves. Even though something is good, it's good to have things, it's good to buy things and to have all these things that we got. But they can, as we know, weigh us down. They can take our minds off of heavenly things. So for the religious, they make a vow to get rid of all of them, right? So as to be totally free to focus on the things of heaven. Wow. All of us, again, are called to a certain level of chastity within, according to our state in life. Yet they radically give up the pleasures of the body, right? By remaining chaste and celibate. In order to say, it's not that the things of the body are bad, they're good. But again, they can weigh us down. They can take our minds off the things of heaven. So they reject those things radically, not because they're bad, but in order to free themselves to ponder more the things of heaven. And also the devil. What was the devil's great sin, if you will? We say it's pride. In a sense, it is pride. It's also disobedience. As Milton's Paradise Lost told us, the devil famously said, "I will not serve." Right? Better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. I will not serve. That's the temptation of all of us: the pride, the disobedience. I won't follow God's laws. Well, the religious, in a radical way, make a vow of obedience to their lawful superiors in their order. Again, so that they can be focused not on the needs of the self, but on making themselves available to the needs of God and the church, putting themselves at the service of others and saying in a radical way, I will serve. Right? So again, and then conversely, we can also think of the evangelical councils as a radical embrace of the imitation of Christ. Now, he was poor, he was chaste, and supremely obedient to the Father. So let me give you a little vocab here that you'll sometimes hear in Catholic circles. These are various words that you see now and then. Just kind of in alphabetical order here. You hear of an abbey. So this is kind of another name for a particular type of monastery or convent. That we say that's, now I'm not talking about Downton Abbey, although Downton Abbey probably, historically, I know it's fiction, but probably at some point in the distant past belonged to the church, and it was an abbey, and there were nuns or something in there. So anyway, but an abbey is kind of another name for certain monasteries, and an abbot or an abbess is the superior of an abbey. There is a priory, which is typically a dependent house of an abbey, right? So you have the big abbey church, and then, so say then 100 miles away, they kind of started another group, right? They kind of ran out of room, so they started another house 50, 100 miles away. That is kind of a daughter house of the main abbey. They call that a priory, and a prior or a prioress is the superior of a priory. There's this term called cloister, funny sounding word. It literally means an enclosure, and traditionally in this context refers to an area of the monastery that is exclusive to the religious. And most places even today still have some type of cloister. You see them in the kind of the traditional sense if you ever go to Europe. Hopefully we'll be able to go back there one of these days. But they'll let you in the old cloister. This would be the area where just the religious would be, right? In other words, no visitors can go in there, no family members, just the monks, just the nuns, right? They're just back in there, exclusive to them. When we talk about cloister as well, some orders are what we call cloistered orders. These are the ones that have minimal contact with the outside world. They're typically contemplative orders. And you've ever seen on the movies, the bars where, the visitors can come into to the parlor there, and there are some bars, and then the nuns are on the other side. Oh, that's actually still happens today. There are places that still have that. So you're kind of locked in a sense, but you're cloistered, right? You belong in there. You kind of radically, in radically rejecting the things of the world, you kind of radically enclose yourself. You cloister yourself with those who together will embrace in a radical way the living of the gospel. And in these particular cases, they have minimal contact with the outside world. We have several cloistered orders here in the Archdiocese. They very rarely go out. They can go out to see the doctor or something like that. But several of them will very rarely go outside. And when they do, it's kind of a big deal. Most of the time they're in their abbey, in the church, in their grounds, and that's where they stay. More vocab, a friar. Okay, so this is the old French word for brother, right? So today, technically, it refers to a male religious, whether it's a priest or a lay brother, of the Dominican, Franciscan, Augustinian, or Carmelite orders. So in other words, if you're a Dominican, whether you're a priest or a brother, you're a Dominican friar, right? A Franciscan friar, an Augustinian, or Carmelite friar. No such thing as a Benedictine friar, right? Those are different. So when you say technically friars, those refer to the brothers that belong to the Dominican, Franciscan, Augustinian, or Carmelite orders. Then there is a monk. So typical usage, this refers to a religious who live in a community, a monastery, a monastic order, such as the Benedictines, the Carthusians, the Trappists, and everything else. Not necessarily a cloistered order, but probably a lot of them were, at least certainly in the past. Those are the monks. Usually when you think of, when you talk about the Benedictines, they're not friars, those are monks, right? They live in community like that. Then there's a nun, a female religious, typically and technically in a cloistered convent, right? If they're not in a cloistered convent, I think more accurately they're just called sisters. A nun traditionally refers to one of the sisters in a cloistered convent. Still referred to as sister. And then there's these couple of strange words, a postulant or a novice. So these refer to an aspirant to a religious order who is in formation. So postulancy and novitiate last for several years, depending on the order, and typically involve some temporary or what we call simple vows. They make simple vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience for the period of a year or 2 or 3 years or something, before eventually making their permanent vows once they are fully become full members of the order. So typically, let's say a young lady wishes to join a female religious order, and she will be invited for a period of aspirancy, we might call it, a year, just kind of checking them out, and they're checking her out, right? And then they'll be kind of formally admitted to the postulancy. And you're a postulant. They may or may not at this point wear the full habit. Often postulants and even novices will wear kind of a partial habit or something that sets them apart from the fully integrated sisters. You might be a postulant for a year or two, and then before moving on to the novitiate or to be a novice. And you're a novice, again, that's kind of another step along the road to being a full member of the community. The novitiate may, again, last a number of years. I think normally between postulancy and novitiate, it's at least, it's got to be at least 5 to 7 years, I want to say, these days along most religious orders. And during this time, you're making these simple vows and renewing them every year until at the end of your novitiate, whenever that might be, 7 years, maybe longer, you will make your formal vows, your permanent vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and be a full member of the community. But until that time, you're either a postulant or a novice. Then the brother or sister, that's a kind of a term of address for any non-clerical religious. So a Franciscan friar who is not a priest, you would call him brother. And the sisters, the women belonging to female religious orders, are all called sisters, except for the Mother Superior, of course. Now the habit. The habit is the religious garb worn by a professed member of a religious order. And these are very often distinctive to the orders. So if you're going down the street in Rome, not today because of what's going on, but if you were walking down the street in Rome, you would see all kinds, dozens of different religious men and women from various numbers of different religious orders, and all of them a little bit different. Different color, different style, and very often you can tell right away that, oh yeah, he's from, for example, a Franciscan. You can always kind of tell the Franciscan habit. It's sort of the Order of Friars Minor. Anyway, it's a brown, kind of a one-piece garment, single piece with a cincture or belt made of white rope around the waist with 3 knots on it. As soon as you see that, there's a Franciscan right there. The Dominicans have a very distinctive habit as well, and many of them do. But that's what they wear. And again, as postulants and novices progress through their formation and approach their permanent vows, they will often wear parts of the habit or maybe a different color or something like that. Finally, a religious name. And traditionally, upon making their vows, new brothers or sisters receive a religious name. Often you'll get this once you're a novice, right? But it's not as common now, but it's still done. And I know a number of orders who still take on religious names. I was in the seminary with one of them, and he got his religious name. He's in my class. He got his religious name about 2 weeks before we graduated and were ordained. So all of a sudden, this guy I've known for however many years, I got to start calling him by a different name. But it's a great long tradition. It's a beautiful tradition. It's from the Bible. We recall Abram. God changed his name to Abraham. God changed Jacob's name into Israel. Jesus, of course, famously changed Simon's name into Peter. Saul became Paul. The idea, and we do it at our baptism and confirmation. We kind of continue on this name. Doesn't mean our legal name has changed or anything, but we take on a new name. And the whole point of this is that just like those characters in the Bible, the new name represents a turning point in life, a new life, if you will, a new identity as a servant of Christ. And so upon reaching a certain point and taking vows, you are given a new name traditionally in their religious orders. And we still do that. Many of them still do that today. And indeed, so do we. But I like that idea that it represents that turning point in life, a new identity as a religious, in a sense, a new identity as belonging totally to Christ. And whether that's in a religious order or at our baptism or confirmation, the same thing still applies. We're at a new stage of life, a new belongingness to Christ in each of those stages. So I found this on the website of a Cistercian monastery, Mepkin Abbey in South Carolina, and just to give you an idea of the day in the life of a monk. Now, just as an explanation, the Cistercians are a very much contemplative order, and they again are enjoined to silence for most of the day, and they support themselves through manual labor. I forget exactly what they do up there in South Carolina, but to give you an idea, in this monastery, they get up at 3 a.m., right, and by 3:20 to 4 o'clock, they do what's called vigils. We would call that the Office of Readings. It's a set of prayers and readings from Scripture and from the Fathers of the Church. They'll be doing that, and they do that communally in the chapel. So from 4 to 4:30, Lectio Divina and private meditation. So Lectio Divina is a type of, if you want to call it a contemplation of the biblical text. Very often you'll be given a verse or two or a short passage and read it slowly, prayerfully, and meditating upon it again and again. It's the living Word of God, and we meditate upon it daily to see what God will speak to us about it. Right? So then from 5 to 6, they have breakfast with Lectio Divina. So in the religious order, especially this one, you're not just gobbling down your food and chit-chatting with everybody. Nope. There, you're eating breakfast, and one of the brothers is reading to you from either Scripture or from one of the writings of the Fathers of the Church, or one of those, or from the founder of the particular order, any of those. So you're kind of listening to this religious text while you're eating in silence, of course. So then you go from breakfast to lauds. That's another name for morning prayer, one of the hours of the liturgy of the hours. Then 7:30 Mass, right? So, all right. So, I mean, before we've even, or most of us are getting up here at 7:30, they've already been in 3-4 hours of prayer, right? By the time we're just getting up. So after Mass, at 8:20, there's Terce. That literally means the third hour. It's a very brief, as you see, 10 minutes, a few readings of the Psalms and a brief Scripture reading. And then grand silence ends. So, I mean, this whole time they're in absolute silence. You respond at Mass or something. If there's a response, the Lord be with you and with your spirit. You can talk then. But you're not chit-chatting at any time with anybody around. You're in complete silence. And you say, well, what if you got to say something to someone? Well, don't say anything. You're just pretty much in silence, right? And then 8:35 to 11:30 in this abbey, they have their morning work period. Again, I don't recall exactly what it is that they do. Many of the Benedictine monasteries around the world, they have farms, and so they raise crops in order to support themselves. They may have some type of woodworking shops. One I know does liturgical vestments for churches around the world. I know one up in Connecticut or New Hampshire, I think, that makes coffins, of all things, but out of wood. So they have very handcrafted and beautiful coffins. Well, so if you're interested in that for later, you can find them. So they'll work from 8:30 to 11:30 there. And then at 12, sext, that's not what you think it means. Get your head out of the gutter. That just means the 6th hour of prayer. Then they have lunch, and then none, which is the 9th hour of prayer. So again, it's a very brief few psalms that they read together, and with a small verse and prayer. And then 1 to 1:40 optional rest. I would think most of them take the option and sit down there for a little while until 1:45, when they're back to their afternoon work, until 3:30. And by the way, when the work period is done and it's time for prayer, the work stops, right? Their first priority is always prayer. That's their job, right? They do the work and everything to support themselves, but their prayer for the glory of God and the good of the church is their prayer. So when it's time to pray, boom, they drop their hammer, or their shovel or whatever they're doing, and they go in to pray. That's their main work. And what a beautiful lesson, right, to all of us. So then they have a little period for rest, and then 5 o'clock dinner. 6 p.m. Vespers, which is another name for an evening prayer. 7:30 Compline, which is another word for night prayer. Again, that one's a pretty short one. And then grand silence begins, and they retire at 8 p.m. You say, wow, they go to bed at 8? That's pretty early. Well, yeah, but they get up at 3 in the morning. So that's I'd probably be asleep by 8 o'clock as well. That gives you an idea of their life. And again, you say, man, I can never live that way. And you're probably right. But for those that are called to it, to those who answer that call, these are joyful and happy people, and they're living the life that Christ has called them to in that particular charism, right? Of silence and contemplation, of prayer and work. And it is a great gift of God to the church. And those monks themselves have given themselves for the good of us and the glory of God by their prayers and their good work. So while it might be something that few of us would choose to do, for those that do choose it, it's a great life of joy and peace and answering the Lord's call. So just to clear this up, there is a difference between a religious, belonging to a religious order, versus a diocesan, particularly when we talk about the priesthood. So religious are members of their order. They don't belong to the diocese. As we said, we talked about a diocese as a geographical area within the church headed by a bishop. So the archdiocese, in this case, of Miami, is Broward, Monroe, and Dade County, Broward, Monroe, and Dade counties, and it's headed by Archbishop Winsky. Religious orders don't belong to the diocese, as I do. They belong to their order. So as such, a religious might be assigned anywhere in the world where the order has a presence. They report to their superior, the abbot or the provincial or whoever it is, their superior. Not exactly to the local bishop, although if they're working in the bishop's territory, the bishop does have some jurisdiction over them. But they report to their superior is their superior. Right? So many religious priests live and work in parishes, depending on the charism of their order. So if you go around the archdiocese, you'll see a number of religious priests that work here. A good example is down in downtown Miami, the parish of Jesu, that's run by the Jesuits. It's an archdiocesan parish, but it's been run by the Jesuits for however many decades now, and the Jesuit priests live there. They live and work with us. We see them, but they are sent there. We have other priests, other parishes run by the Dominicans and such, and we have various religious scattered around from here and there throughout the archdiocese, depending on their particular order. So diocesan priests do not belong to an order. So some people ask me, what order do you belong to? I do not belong to an order. I belong to a diocese. I'm not a religious priest. I'm a diocesan priest. So rather diocesan priests like me belong to a diocese and under the authority of the local bishop, or in this case, the archbishop. And I think that is it. So there's our lesson on religious orders and the church.